You think you're a SEAL, old man? Show me your ID. Now, Cole Harris growled as he stepped in close to Frank Weller's face. Frank said nothing. He stood straight, the simplicity of his red polo shirt clashing completely with the stream of young service members moving through the corridor. No access badge, no military paperwork. Just an 81-year-old man with a calmness so steady it bordered on unsettling. Harris narrowed his eyes in mockery. Don't tell me you know Vice Admiral Marcus Rayner. That trick is ancient. Frank answered with a low, steady voice that didn't waver. I'm here to see an old friend. That's all. The reply only made Harris angrier. An old friend in one of the most secure intelligence facilities in the Navy. You think I'm an idiot? He reached out, grabbing Frank's wrist, ready to twist it behind his back for handcuffs. In that exact moment, Frank's sleeve slid up, revealing a faded UDT-21 tattoo, a skeletal frog gripping a stick of dynamite, drawn in the rough blue-black ink style of the 1960s, its edges blurred by decades of sun and time. Harris didn't understand what he was looking at. But at a nearby workstation, Ensign Drew Collins shot to his feet, his face drained of color as he recognized the marking the calling card of the earliest UDT generation, the men who paved the way for what would later become the SEALs. Collins immediately picked up the secure phone, whispering into the encrypted line, "Notify the Admiral. Right now, his name is Frank Weller." No one in the corridor knew that a single name had just brought Vice Admiral Rayner's top-secret briefing to a complete halt. Then it came, that sound, the heavy, urgent rhythm of approaching footsteps from the far end of the hall. Office sailors snapped to attention at once. No one spoke. The air thickened. A figure of authority was approaching. Someone whispered, "Admiral, inbound. If you believe that true courage doesn't lie in gunfire, but in the silence carried by those who have walked through war, subscribe to brave veteran stories and help us preserve the memories, dignity, and honor of our quiet heroes." Frank Weller stood motionless, his wrists still locked in the cold metal cuffs, his aged eyes lowered to the spotless floor that reflected the faint veins on his forehead. No excuses. No resistance. Only the quiet of a man long accustomed to waiting on the thin line between life and death. The corridor continued to move like the mechanical organism it was, the low hum of the air system steady like the breath of a steel giant. The sharp, rhythmic footsteps of young sailors passing by, the distant clatter of metal from the equipment bay. But to Frank, it all blended into a dull haze of sound, as if he had stepped out of the present moment and back into the inner corridors of his own memory. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear or anxiety, but because the memory surged too quickly. Just a second ago, he had felt the cold bite of the handcuffs on his wrist. The next second, he felt the cold mud and black water of a place half a world away. The Mekong Delta. A thick, suffocating darkness where only the roar of PBR engines cut through the night. The black water like a shattered mirror reflecting the young faces packed tightly together on the boat's deck. Faces Frank still remembered clearly, their smiles, their jokes, the short, brave nods they shared before plunging into the murky water. A promise carved into stone: bring each other home, no matter what. For a moment, his chest tightened, not from pain, but from having lived too many times within reach of death, so that now a pair of handcuffs meant nothing. Frank had stood still like this before, chest deep in mud, waiting for the extraction signal, in a silence so suffocating it could crush a man. A wait that felt like a century, even though it lasted only minutes. Harris stood opposite him. The young man kept a stern face, but deep in his eyes was a flicker of unease he didn't understand. Frank's silence unsettled him more than any argument would have. A man in cuffs, insulted, humiliated, he should have protested, should have raged, should have fought back. But Frank didn't. He simply stood there, breathing steadily, like someone who had been misunderstood his entire life. His silence created a strange void in the bustling hallway. A void that made Harris uneasy. A void that made nearby sailors pause their conversations. A void that made even the hum of the air system sound louder. Frank lifted his eyes slightly, his voice deep and rough, like weathered wood. I've stood still like this before, waiting for the signal to pull out. The sentence wasn't an explanation. It was a fragment of memory that slipped out heavy and unintended, and it caused Harris to hesitate for a brief moment. Frank looked around, but his pale blue eyes weren't seeing the corridor of a secure military facility. They were seeing something far away, a place where he had lost brothers in arms whose voices he still remembered even at 81, where he still heard the splash of water against the hull, the smell of mud and gunpowder tangled together. The silence expanded and wrapped around him like an old blanket. Not the silence of weakness. The silence of someone who has lived long enough to know that words can sometimes make pain heavier. The silence of a warrior who has seen things the young will never understand. The silence of dignity. Frank stood there without avoiding anyone's gaze. He didn't need to defend himself, didn't need to prove anything, didn't need to raise himself up or bring anyone down. His simple presence, quiet and steady, spoke louder than any argument. Then from ahead, Harris's voice suddenly cut through the fragile stillness. "All right, old man, don't just stand there. Move." And in that moment when silence shattered the story, prepared to step into deeper wounds to the place where public humiliation was waiting for Frank, Harris clenched his teeth, his young heated face pushed up close to Frank Weller. "You disgrace the men who actually fought." His voice sliced through the hallway like a knife, loud enough to make several people turn their heads. Office sailors whispered among themselves, someone even let out a short, hollow laugh, thin and empty like air running out. "Another old man who thinks he used to be special forces," someone muttered mockingly. Frank didn't answer. He remained standing tall, his aging body like an old tree that had survived dozens of storms. Seeing that only fueled Harris's irritation. "And that tattoo," Harris snarled, grabbing Frank's arm and yanking it upward, "cheap, fake garbage." The words hit deep, straight into the layer of memories Frank had kept sealed for decades. One heartbeat later, the old images burst open like a hatch kicking loose. He no longer felt the polished floor beneath him. He felt himself crawling through thick, choking mud, gripping slick mangrove roots to stay steady. Cold river water ran along his neck. Mud rose to his chest. C4 explosions ripped the earth with violent tremors. The smell of gunpowder fused with the stench of river mud. A flash tore through the night, then everything went dark. Frank drew in a deep breath. Just a few seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. Harris saw none of what flickered through those tired eyes. To him, Frank was just a stubborn old man refusing to comply. So he shoved Frank hard against the wall, rougher than before. "Turn around!" "I'm searching you," Harris barked. The impact didn't shake Frank. He braced his palms against the wall, breathing slow, steady in that way only those who've stood at the edge of death can manage. Harris slapped a hand onto his shoulder, rummaging through his pockets as if searching for proof of a lie. Frank spoke softly, his voice so low only those closest could hear. "You don't know what you're putting your hands on, son. Not a threat. Not bragging. Just the truth, plain as age, sharp as memory." A female staffer walked by, her eyes catching on the faded tattoo. She froze, then whispered to the person beside her that looks like a real UDT tattoo. A tiny sentence as thin as a draft of air, yet sharp enough for several others to hear, and their faces shifted instantly. Because inked on Frank's arm was not some modern illustration, but the crude, sun-worn lines of the UDT-21 skeletal frog, the emblem of the men who built the foundation for the first SEAL teams, the mark worn only by those who truly belonged to that generation. Still, Harris ignored it. He gripped harder, forcing Frank flat against the wall. In his eyes, this was nothing more than an old man pretending in order to avoid being thrown out of the base. Frank bowed his head, not in submission. It was the kind of bow from someone who had witnessed so much death that there was nothing left to prove. His breathing rose and fell slow, as distant tides and that quiet endurance didn't make him look small. It made the entire hallway feel tighter with an unspoken shame. A wave of tension spread from where they stood. No one spoke yet. Everyone sensed something was terribly wrong. The humiliation Harris pushed onto Frank was no longer a security procedure. It had crossed into that fragile boundary between respect and blindness. Then Harris growled, "Old man, you'd better wise up. You do what I tell you." He didn't realize his hand was squeezing harder than necessary. Frank closed his eyes for a moment. Mud. Water. Explosions. His teammates' faces fading into the night. A lifetime none of the people in this hallway could ever comprehend. But his silence remained thick solid as cooled steel. It tightened Harris's nerves and held the crowd's attention captive. The humiliation had reached its peak, and just when Harris believed all the power was his, things began to shift. At the very moment, Harris's hand tightened once more. The rapid, heavy footsteps from the far end of the corridor thundered toward them, dragging the air with it, as if authority itself was racing straight to where they stood. Ensign Drew Collins remained frozen behind his desk, both hands tightening around the secure phone. He had just heard the name Frank Weller come out of his own mouth, a name he had only ever seen in special operations training manuals, where the man was described like a legend, not an old man in handcuffs standing in a hallway. Collins exhaled sharply and dialed the direct line to the Admiral's office. After a single ring, the aide's voice came through sharp, cold, and clipped. Collins swallowed hard, then reported in a low but clear voice, "Sir, this is urgent. A detained civilian's name is, Frank Weller." A silence stretched out tight as a drawn wire. Then the aide asked again, each word squeezed out with tension. "Who did you say Frank Weller, sir?" Another silence, heavier this time. Then Collins heard a conference room door swing open so forcefully that the sound carried through the phone. The distant voice of Vice Admiral Marcus Rayner rose, unable to hide his shock. "You're certain?" Frank Weller Collins stood at attention, instinctively answering, as if Rayner were right in front of him in the flesh. "Yes, Admiral. I saw the name on his driver's license myself." Without another word, Rayner spoke directly into the phone. "Hold him right there. I'm coming down." No explanation, no hesitation, not even a breath between words. Collins set the phone down, feeling as though he had just pulled an enormous underwater current into a hallway that moments before had been quiet and ordinary. Inside the top-secret briefing room, Rayner stood rigid like a steel column. Senior officers still studying intelligence screens turned around in confusion as he abruptly halted his report. Rayner placed a hand on the table, took a deep breath as if steadying a racing heartbeat, and pronounced each word clearly. "I have something I must deal with immediately." No one dared ask what. He left the room at once, the master gunnery sergeant following closely behind. The air around them seemed to compress into pure authority, a kind of power not born of rank alone, but of loyalty, reverence, and the weight of honoring a warrior time had not been able to erase. Meanwhile, in the hallway, Harris was still reporting loudly into his radio, detaining a stolen valor suspect, preparing transfer to security. His voice was hard and self-satisfied, as if he had just completed an important mission. Then suddenly, all sound died. A heavy, decisive rhythm of footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor steps that carried a kind of authority strong enough to make young sailors straighten up by reflex. Everyone who had been walking froze mid-stride as if the very air in the base had been pulled in one direction. Frank remained still. Harris turned, confusion flashing across his face as he realized the crowd was parting, clearing a path for someone approaching. Marcus Rayner came into view sharp in his immaculate white service dress uniform, the twin stars on his shoulder boards gleaming. Beside him walked the master gunnery sergeant, his chest layered with medals, each one a story written in blood and iron. They advanced together, and no one dared speak first, because everyone could feel the storm of anger gathering in Rayner's every step. When Rayner's eyes fell on Frank's cuffed hands, his expression transformed entirely. Shock shifted to fury. Fury shifted to heartbreak. Then heartbreak hardened into the authority of a commander ready to protect the man he revered. He marched straight toward Harris, close enough that the young sailor instinctively stepped back. Rayner's voice dropped low and heavy, hitting the floor like iron. "Who gave you permission to lay a hand on him?" The entire hallway held its breath. A few sailors turned their heads away, unable to withstand the pressure in the air. Harris went rigid as if someone had drained the blood from his body. Rayner didn't look at anyone else. His eyes remained fixed on the steel cuffs biting into Frank's wrists, and those eyes alone were enough to make any junior officer understand that a sacred boundary had just been crossed. Without needing instruction, the master gunnery sergeant stepped forward, ready to remove the cuffs the moment the order was given. And at that instant, everyone understood that power in the hallway had shifted, away from the hot-headed young sailor back to the place where it belonged, with the men who had bled and carried memories that built this force from the ground up. The escalation was complete. Frank was no longer a suspect, no longer an old man, no longer a target of cheap accusations. Only a single truth now filled the hallway, a truth so heavy no one dared breathe too loudly. At that moment, Rayner turned to Frank, his eyes filled with years of unspoken reverence. "Frank." He didn't need to say more. Everyone understood. The truth had just opened its door. And in that brief exchange of glances, everything Frank had carried through a lifetime began to surface, paving the way for a moment of recognition no one in that hallway would ever forget. Vice Admiral Marcus Rayner stood before Frank Weller, like a man who had just rediscovered something precious that time had once taken from him. His eyes hardened not out of anger, but out of a reverence that had been suppressed for far too long, inside a base that had forgotten the very names that built its foundations. He turned to the master gunnery sergeant, his voice sharp as a battlefield order. "Remove the cuffs, immediately." The sound of the key turning in the lock echoed clearly, striking every ear like a moment of awakening. When the restraints snapped open, Frank's wrists twitched slightly. He drew his hands forward and gently rubbed the red marks left on his skin. Yet he neither blamed, complained, nor resented. There was only the calm of a man who had lived more than 80 years between war and peace, between honor and silence. Frank lifted his head. Raynor saw those eyes, pale blue eyes that had once watched the black rivers of Vietnam, eyes that had witnessed brothers fall in the night, eyes that had seen the flash of explosives and yet somehow preserved the warmth of camaraderie. Raynor inhaled slowly, stood straight heels together, and raised his right hand in the exact angle of a Navy ceremonial salute. Every movement was flawless. And then, in the middle of the crowded hallway, under the gaze of dozens of young service members, he spoke strong and clear as a bell. "Master Chief Weller, welcome back." The words struck the hallway like lightning. No one blinked. No one dared breathe. A Vice Admiral, a man commanding an entire region, was the one to salute first, to speak first, to honor first. In the culture of the United States Navy, this wasn't just respect. It was acknowledgement that the man standing before them was a true legend. Frank nodded gently, answering the formality with a look softer than any spoken gratitude. Without needing words, Raynor understood he saw this not as a ritual between ranks, but as a reunion between two shipmates. The crowd was stunned. A few stepped back instinctively, as if they feared they had stood too close to someone they ought to salute from afar. Name tags, rank insignias, polished boots, everything shrank in importance beside the presence of a veteran who had endured things they had only read about in training manuals. Harris stood frozen, his face drained of color, his lips trembling as though he wanted to speak, but couldn't force out a sound. In his eyes were fear, shame, and something deeper, a collapse of pride as he realized who he had just humiliated. Raynor turned to Harris but said nothing. His silence was more terrifying than any reprimand. It was a silence that seemed to say, "You crossed a line you never understood." Then Raynor turned back to Frank, resting a gentle hand on his arm, his voice low but filled with reverence. "We owe you an apology." Frank smiled, and his aged eyes glowed with a gentle light. "There's no need, Marcus. I know you've got 100 things to handle. This was just a misunderstanding." But those words could not stop the shockwave spreading through the hallway. The young sailor who had mocked him now stared at the ground. Office staff straightened unconsciously, hands folded before them. No one dared comment on the tattoo. No one mentioned stolen valor. No one looked at him as some old man anymore. Everyone realized they had been wrong about someone history would forever call a legend. Raynor turned toward the entire hallway. His voice rose louder, carrying the weight of truth for everyone within earshot. "No one touches him. No one treats him like a civilian. This is Master Chief Frank Weller, a man most of you will never have the courage to measure up to." A chill ran down many spines. It wasn't an insult. It was the truth. The heartbeat of the hallway seemed to synchronize into one. There were no ranks now, no distance, only eyes fixed on Frank, not because of age or appearance, but because of something greater than uniform or rank, the dignity of a man who had bled for this country. Raynor looked at Frank once more, his voice softer yet heavy with meaning. "Frank, they need to know who you are." And with that reverence, a story buried for decades began to surface, as if the entire base was about to confront a truth it was never prepared to face. Vice Admiral Marcus Raynor stood before the entire hallway, like a witness to a piece of history about to be revealed. He turned and looked at each face, young sailors, intelligence staff, technicians, security personnel, people who had no idea who they were standing next to. Then he took a slow breath and spoke loudly, every word carrying weight. Frank Weller was a founding member of UDT-21, the predecessor of SEAL Team 2. The words dropped like a heavy stone, thickening the air in the hallway. A young sailor swallowed hard, the sound so clear that those around him froze. A few others instinctively adjusted their uniforms, as if they needed to straighten themselves, before hearing more about the man standing only a few steps away. Raynor continued, his voice deep and laced with a rare admiration he seldom allowed others to see. He received a Navy Cross, 3 silver stars, 5 bronze stars with the V for valor. Many of his actions are still classified. The entire hallway went silent. Faces that had been smirking moments earlier turned stiff as stone. Some of the older personnel recognized the name UDT-21 from history books, yet never imagined they would meet one of its founders in the middle of their own base. Raynor lowered his voice, but each sentence still struck straight into the hearts of those listening. When I was struggling to pass math at the academy, he was pulling brothers out of gunfire in the Black Rivers of Vietnam. Frank said nothing, but his memories spoke for him. A brief flashback surged through him, Frank wading through the Mekong River in 1968, chest deep in mud, pulling a wounded teammate onto the boat, while fire from the distant shore cast trembling bands of yellow across the water. Young faces smeared with mud and blood, yet still managing tired smiles, the kind of smiles worn by men who knew they could die at any moment, but pushed on anyway. Frank closed his eyes for a second. The memory shut gently like a notebook closing. Harris stood a few steps away, head bowed low. His shoulders trembled, not from fear of punishment, but from the crushing weight of shame because he had humiliated one of the men the entire special warfare community revered like a cornerstone. Raynor saw it, but he said nothing, because the person who needed to speak was Frank. Frank lifted a hand and placed it gently on Raynor's shoulder, a simple gesture, yet enough to calm the Admiral instantly. His voice was rough, but warm like an older brother guiding a younger one. Don't blame him. He was doing his job. Harris looked up, eyes red, unable to speak. Frank saw in his eyes true remorse, not fear, not self-preservation, but genuine regret. It softened him in a way only those who have lost comrades would understand. Raynor turned back to Frank with gratitude and admiration mingled together. You're always like this, he said quietly, always seeing the best in people. Frank smiled. Because someone once did the same for me. The silence that followed was no longer the silence of tension. It was the silence of respect, the kind that only appears when people stand before something greater than themselves. And in that quiet, the hallway began to understand what Raynor had known all along. They hadn't just misjudged a man. They had misjudged a piece of the United States Navy's legacy. The moment Frank lifted his hand away from Raynor's shoulder, the door to a lesson in forgiveness and the spiritual strength of a legend began to open, drawing every gaze toward the heart of the story, waiting to unfold. Raynor called Harris to step out into the center of the hallway, right in front of Frank. The young sailor walked forward with his shoulders stiffened, his hands clenched, as if trying to hide the trembling inside him. Shame was written plainly across his face, the kind of shame that keeps a person from looking at themselves, let alone looking at the man they had just insulted. Raynor spoke first, his voice sharp. Petty Officer Harris, you. But Frank placed a hand on Raynor's forearm so light, it felt like a breath, yet enough to make the Admiral stop immediately. Frank shook his head gently. Marcus, don't come down on him too hard. Harris looked up, and his eyes red as if he wanted to say, I don't deserve your defense, but the words caught in his throat. Frank met his eyes. There was no judgment there. He spoke slowly, with the aged but vigorous voice of someone who had once stood in the very center of a battlefield. We were young once, too. We didn't know anything, except that we had to guard the gate. Someone in the crowd gave a small nod. They understood the burden on a young sailor wasn't just duty, it was the fear of making mistakes, the fear of not being good enough, the fear of not knowing what the right thing was. Frank lowered his head slightly, as though looking into his own past. A faint flashback brushed through his mind. A makeshift tent on a muddy sandbar where a young teammate held a homemade tattoo machine, nothing more than a small motor fitted with a needle. The smells of mud and sweat mixed with gravelly laughter. That friend had said, old man someday, don't let anyone tell you you don't belong here. Frank sat still as the crude needle carved into his skin, the image of the UDT-21 skeletal frog, a symbol of a family that never abandoned one another, whether in black water or in red fire. The memory faded, giving way once more to the present. Frank turned back to Harris. His pale blue eyes held no intimidation, no dominance, only the deep understanding of someone who had once made mistakes, once been afraid, once tried his very best. He said, the hardest thing isn't recognizing the enemy. It's seeing the human being standing right in front of you. The words hit Harris like a blow to the chest. He inhaled shakily, then nodded, no longer trying to hide his emotions. Sir, I'm sorry. I truly am. Frank smiled, a gentle, warm smile that seemed to soften the entire hallway. You'll be a good leader someday. Not because you're strong, but because you know how to bow your head when you're wrong. Harris bowed deeply this time, not out of rank, but out of respect. Raynor stood beside them, watching the moment unfold. With emotion, he no longer tried to hide. He understood that Frank hadn't simply forgiven the young sailor. He had just passed on a legacy more valuable than any medal, the legacy of kindness in the midst of war, of mercy, in the midst of misunderstanding, of dignity standing firm in the storm. Frank reached out, placed his hand on Harris's shoulder and gave it a gentle squeeze, a gesture that ended the heaviness in the air, a gesture that washed away the shame clinging to the young sailor's heart. And then the once tense hallway softened, as if everyone was learning from him to take one step back, to understand instead of stepping forward to judge. Frank's forgiveness did not stop with Harris. It spread like a quiet current, opening the way for greater changes soon to come, across the entire base, ensuring that no one would ever repeat that painful mistake again. In the days following the incident in that hallway, the entire base seemed to breathe differently. There were no public reprimands, no loud announcements, no long lectures. But a quiet change spread through the system like a red thread running from end to end, a new policy on how to treat veterans and how to recognize the history of special warfare units. Notices were posted in every training area, every security office, every main quarter, and people called it by a short but weighty name, the Weller Protocol, a mandatory standard teaching young sailors to look deeper into a person before judging the uniform they wore. Not just a lesson on identifying UDT or SEAL insignias or the symbols of other special operations units, but a lesson in respect and humility, the values war could never strip away from those who survived it. In the chow hall, someone murmured, "Careful, don't forget the Weller Protocol." In the security watchroom, another sighed. We almost misjudged a legend, and somewhere in the barracks, people whispered that respect doesn't always come from rank, but from memory, loyalty, and the things no one can see with their eyes. One peaceful afternoon, Harris made his way to the small cafe just outside the base gate, where a little table sat under a tree, the place Frank Weller often chose. A soft breeze drifted through, carrying the faint smell of the sea. Harris paused for a few seconds before approaching, as if gathering the courage to face the unfinished weight in his heart. Frank looked up at the sound of footsteps. Harris bowed deeply, his voice small, as if afraid of disturbing the quiet air. "Sir, I came to apologize again." Frank studied him for a few seconds. Then he nodded gently and pointed to the chair across from him. "Sit down, son. Black coffee. Bitter but real. Try it." Harris sat, hands on the table, like a new recruit waiting for guidance. He took a sip, his face tightening at the bitterness, but he drank again. Frank let out a soft chuckle, a rare warm laugh like old embers glowing beneath ash. "Where are you from?" Frank asked. "Ohio, sir. And why did you join the Navy? Because I wanted to do something meaningful." Frank nodded. A few quiet seconds passed like drops of water falling onto stone. His eyes drifted past the road toward the black waters that once wrapped around his legs in 1968. But this time there was a strange peace in his gaze. No pain, no heaviness. Only the ease of someone who had finally passed on what needed to be passed on. As Frank lifted his coffee, his sleeve slipped a little. Harris saw the UDT-21 tattoo, the crude skeletal frog holding a simple explosive, charge, its ink faded and sun-worn after decades. But what took Harris's breath away wasn't the tattoo, it was the meaning behind it. It was no longer a symbol of war or violent past. It was a symbol of loyalty, of brothers lost, of nights drowned in mud, and the long silence that followed. It was the mark of a man who lived without flaunting, who fought without asking for recognition, who suffered losses without seeking pity. Harris looked at the tattoo as if seeing a part of himself reflected in it, the part that wanted to grow, to understand more deeply, to become the kind of leader Frank had believed he could be. The two men sat there for a long while, no more words needed. The silence was no longer tense like that day in the hallway. It was the silence of mutual understanding, of continuity, of passing values from one generation to the next. When Harris stood to leave, Frank spoke a single sentence. "Remember what you learned that day?" "Yes, sir," Harris replied, his voice firmer. "I'll never forget." Frank smiled and looked toward the road, where the late afternoon sun stretched out like a quiet layer of gold. In that moment, he felt truly at peace. He knew he had left behind something worth more than any medal, a legacy of kindness and dignity. Brave veteran stories. We remember the quiet heroes. If this story makes you believe that honor and kindness never retire, please like and share this video and subscribe to Brave Veteran Stories so that none of their memories are ever forgotten.